Welcome, everybody, to this webinar, Manuscripts Live, featuring music in medieval books. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Andrew Dunning, and I'm a curator of medieval manuscripts at the Bodleian Library, where I am currently sitting. And just to let you know a few practical things before we start, we'll be recording this event, but this is a Zoom webinar. So your video and your audio are turned off, and you won't appear in the video. We'll be able to hear you, and you can sing just as loudly as you want in complete safety. We'll be looking at some original medieval manuscripts that feature the music. We'll be singing. So if you would like to ask a question about medieval music, about the manuscripts, about manuscripts in general, please do type it into the Q&A window during the event, and you might want to check now that you can find the Q&A button in Zoom. You can also vote for questions if you're interested in them by clicking on the thumbs up button, and you can also comment on questions there. So once again, welcome. We developed this series as Singing Together Apart over the last year as a series of public engagement events with the manuscripts from German-speaking lands project, which was sponsored by the Polonsky Foundation. The plan for this evening is to revisit one of the chants from our last session, which is led by our singers who are in the Crypt of St-Peter-in-the-East, now the Library of St Edmund Hall, and then to find out about today's piece and how it fits into the lives of the nuns of Medingen Abbey. We'll learn this piece and sing it together by ear, followed by a discussion about the manuscript and where it's found. Thanks to the Polonsky German project, we can view the full manuscripts online through the digital Bodleian website. We've also created a modern PDF version of the text, which we sent around earlier, with notations, so you can follow along if you like, but you'll also be able to see the music on your screen. And remember, we can't see you, we can't hear you, so you can sing as loudly as you like, and you'll be able to ask questions before we wrap up. Now, in the crypt, we have Henrike Lähnemann, who is a professor of medieval German here at Oxford, Zachary Guiliano, who is the college chaplain and a research fellow at St Edmund Hall. We have also Nick Swarbrick, who is an associate lecturer at Oxford Brookes University, and he's also our singing leader today. And also we have Connor Wood in the crypt, who is standing in as a singer. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and that you open up the manuscripts for us. And we have built up a bit of repertoire over the last year. So we thought we would take you along the liturgical year and actually open the book. The book you see here is the handbook of the Medingen provost, written by the nuns of Medingen in the early 1470s and reworked in 1478 to conform with a newly expanded liturgy that came in with the reform. And the pieces that we are singing today actually all come in when the nuns tried to get more of their voices heard. So the manuscript starts with a liturgical year at Christmas, but the first major feast is Candlemas, since Mary was the patron saint of all the Cistercian houses, also of Medingen. And the first thing we are going to sing is the extended version of the Nunc dimittis, the Song of Simeon, where the nuns wrote in a repetitio for them, so they repeat the praise of the light after each of the verses. This is the first piece of music which you also have in the PDF that was sent to you, so you would be welcome to join in whenever the Schola is singing Lumen ad revelacionem gencium. Lumen ad revelationem gencium et gloriam plebis tuae Israel. Nunc dimittis servum tuum Domine, secundum verbum tuum in pace,
Lumen ad revelationem gencium, et gloriam plebis tue Israel. Quia videont oculi mei, salutare tuum. Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tue Israel. Quod parasti, antifasiem omnium populorum, Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tue Israel. Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tue Israel. Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tue Israel. Gloria Patri et Filio, et Spiritui Sancto, Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tue Israel. Sic ut erat in principio et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tue Israel.
Continuing to leaf through the handbook of the Medingen provost, we come to the Lent-tide. So the next major thing would actually be Palm Sunday. So all the occasions where the nuns and the clergy would meet up together, and then Ash Wednesday, when the provost would go up to the nuns' gallery to dispense the ashes, and then Good Friday. And but the biggest part in the manuscript is taken up by the dramatic events around Easter, which start actually on Good Saturday with the singing of several important chants. And you can see how this was extended if Andrew arrives at folio 31 recto. Carefully turning the pages. It's always a joy to see somebody skillfully handling a manuscript. On the left-hand side, you see the lead up ad incensum. You see the red crosses where the provost would do a blessing. And if you look fairly closely, you see time and again this seven-shaped Tironian note meaning an et, an end. And you see that in the 3 columns to the left, this et sign always has one slash through. And that's the easy way to tell apart the old and the new part, because the nun who extended the repertoire in 1478 always crossed her T double, or the et in this case. So you can see at the furthest right-hand column what's squeezed at the bottom, de inde dominus preposit solemnita et jucunda voce. The et has 2 crosses through. So the rubric to tell what actually the provost had to do for the Exultet is added in. And I'm handing over now to Zach Guiliano to tell us a bit more about the importance of the Exultet.
Thank you. So yes, you have that instruction to sing with a solemn but a joyful voice, the Exultet. Sort of like before, as I tell you about it, I want you to kind of cast your mind across the whole of the liturgical year. And if you've been present for earlier workshops, we've talked about the blessing of lights at Candlemas, and then the Easter anthem, Victime, paschali, laudes. Today we're focusing as well on, yes, the singing of the Exultet at the Easter Vigil. So from the earliest times, we have records of Christian liturgy. The Easter Vigil was the scene of powerful liturgical rites, not least the baptism of converts. And we're not entirely sure when some rites came in, but we do know that the blessing of a large paschal candle entered the liturgy. And there seem to be some references to a blessing of light at the Easter Vigil, at least in works of the mid-4th century, sort of around 335 to 340. You start seeing this more frequently. And there are, of course, different texts and different ways of doing this, but eventually a single text for this blessing was adopted in the West, so the Exultet. It appeared in the earliest Latin liturgical books called sacramentaries, though for a little while there were some slightly different versions circulating in the ancient world. The Exultet was normally performed by a deacon, and the deacon calls upon the whole company of heaven and earth and all members of the church to rejoice in the victory of Christ, who is praised as the Lamb of the Passover. As the text goes on, it mirrors biblical language from Exodus, Deuteronomy, and the New Testament. This is the night when you led our forebears, Israel's children, from slavery in Egypt. This is the night when Christ broke the prison bars of death. And at the end, the singer asks God to accept the candle as an offering from the church, that its light may join the lights of heaven and still be found burning when Christ, the morning star, returns. And various ceremonies surrounded the singing of the Exultet and the blessing of the lights of the candle. At the least, incense would be placed in a thurible, and the candle would be censed solemnly. But often it would be marked with a cross, or incense would be placed inside of the candle itself. Often 5 grains or beads of incense for the 5 wounds of Christ. And I just say that this involves quite a bit of the person who's singing and doing the various things. There's a certain amount of performative skill involved, both in chanting the text usually and then completing the ceremonies around it and various prayers. I've just got a little bit of time, and I want to say something about the music. Generally speaking, the music of the Exultet could use more study. There are a lot of varieties of chant used for this text in the Middle Ages. And I say notably that the form of chant used at Medingen differs from that widely known today, and from other late medieval versions that would sound similar, and even from other versions sung in Cistercian abbeys and convents. I'm just going to give you a few little samples so you can get a sense of how this differs, and hopefully my mind will keep up with my intent as I do this, because it's easy to get yourself mixed up while singing different sorts of chant on the same text. So here's an example of the chant we're all familiar with today, generally speaking, and it's from the 1970 Missal of the Roman Catholic Church.
Exultentiam angelica turba celorum, exultent divina mysteria, et pro tanti regis victoria, tuba insonet salutaris.
So keep that sort of soundscape in your mind now as I sing you another one. This is from late medieval Salisbury, so the Sarum Rite. And generally speaking, it's very similar, but it's more elaborate. There are more melismatic moments where I will again pray that I don't make any mistakes. But there's an attentiveness to the text. It's a little less repetitive than the modern version. So here we go. Exultentiam angelica turba celorum,
Exultet divina mysteria, et pro tanti regis victoria, tuba intonet salutaris.
So you have a sense of how the line moves a lot more and responds to the text in different ways. It continues like that as well, whereas in some versions of the chant, the next word, gaudiant, rejoice basically, might just be a couple notes. In the Serum it goes, gaudeatelus. So there's an enjoyment of the chant. Now I'm going to sing you the version at Medingen, which we'll hear more of later on, but I'll give you a sample now, if I have not terribly lost the page.
Well, you have the manuscript.
I have the manuscript in front of me. That's a little harder to read, that's true. Can I just borrow yours? Yeah, thank you. A bit easier. So the initial interval is the same, and some of the others are, but then there are some changes. So.
Exultentiam angelica turba celorum, exultent divina mysteria, et pro tanti regis victoria, tuba insonet salutaris.
So if you notice the difference, again, the initial intervals are pretty similar, and there's some similar endings, but it's much simpler. Generally, you're singing on a single note. The main chanting tone is sort of the focus, and then you kind of end when the line ends. And then there's a single really melismatic passage, and that's at the main end of a line. And that's then repeated and repeated and repeated. So if I just say something briefly, they have very different feels to them. But partly I think this relates to the question of what's possible. So the modern one from the 1970s, again, is a little more elaborate than that, but it mostly repeats the same idea over and over and over again. But it plays with the interval between the main chanting tone, the one below it, and then a fifth below the main chanting tone, and a sort of semitone below that. Whereas then with Serum, it's sort of all over the place, really. You kind of have a rollicking time with the line. And then finally, with Medingen, again, it's sort of more repetitive, simpler. This might relate to the skill level of the person who had to sing it initially, or it could just be the customary chant for that time. There's more work that could be done on that, but we'll talk more about this in a moment. So.
Many thanks, Zach, for this comparative chanting. So Nick is now going to sing excerpts from the Exultet. We tried it yesterday. It takes in full 14.5 minutes. So we decided to cut it down to some of the most significant elements of the chant, and you will be invited to be the congregation at Medingen and answer on the Dominus Vobiscum. Again, you have it in the PDF. You won't have it in the manuscript because the provost didn't need to know the responses. He only had to know his part. And this actually is one of the old bits. You can again see the 7-shaped at with just one crossing through, and the nuns decided not to replace it with a Cistercian used to keep the diocese of Verden, to which they belonged, but they added in, as I said, this rubric joyfully and solemnly. So that colors the whole performance that we are now going to do.
Exultatiam angelica turba celorum, exultent divina mysteria, et pro tanti regis victoria, tuba insonet salutaris. Per Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum Filium eius, qui cum eo et Spiritus Sancti vivit et regnat Deus, per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Dominus vobiscum,
Et cum spiritu tuo.
sursum corda.
Habemus ad Domino.
Gratias agamus Domino Deo nostro.
Dignum et justus.
Ec nox est, de qua scriptum est, et nox ut dies illuminabitur, et nox illuminatio mea in delicis meis. Huius igitur sanctificatio noctis, fugat scelera, culpat lavat, et redet innocentiam lapis, mentis laetitiam, fuget odia, concordiam parat, et curat imperia. In huius igitur noctis gratia, surscipe sancte pater. Incensi huius sacrificium vespertinum, quod tibi in hac cerei oblationes solemni, per ministrodum manus Deo per vibus apum, sancto sacra redit ecclesia, sed iam columnae uius preconia novimus, quam in honorem Dei rutilans ignis accendit. Qui licet divisus in partes, mutuatitamen luminis detrimenta non novit. Precamur ergo te, Domine, ut nos famulos tuos omnem clerum, et devotissimum populum, una cum Papa nostro Francisco, et gloriosissima Regina nostra Elisabetta, nec non et antistite nostro Stefano, qui et temporum concessa, in his festis Paschalia conservare et inheris, per Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum Filium tuum, qui tecum vivit et regnat Deus per omnia saecula saeculorum. Amen.
We are now going to explore further the Exultet, both in the handbook of the Medingen Provost and in the prayer books of the nuns. And this is now over to two graduate students from Oxford University. The first, Marlene Schilling, who has just written her master dissertation on the personification of the night in the Medingen prayer books, and then Carolin, who is working on a DPhil project on the Medingen manuscripts.
Thank you very much, Henrike. Yes, so for my dissertation for the Master of Studies in Modern Languages, which I handed in a couple of weeks ago, I worked on the personification of Easter night in the Medingen Easter prayer books, as Henrike mentioned. And one origin of this tradition of personifying this special night of the resurrection of Christ can be found in the Exultet that we just heard, where the night is personified as the only one worthy enough to know the exact moment of the Easter miracle. In the Exultet, the Easter night is also characterized as bright and as full of light as the day, which we also just heard, or maybe even did sing. Haec nox est de quas scriptum est, et nox ut dies illuminabitur. In my dissertation, very briefly, I focused on how the nuns in Medingen worked these concepts into their own Easter meditation using the personification of the Easter night. And one example is the Easter prayer book in the Bodleian Library 01. So maybe, Andrew, could we have a look at the manuscript and maybe folio 25 verso, that is more or less that's the folio with this quote. And we'll see the prayer book is definitely smaller than the handbook. Yes. It's just so tiny. That's the beginning of the Exultet, and perfect. Yes, there it is. So here we have the quote from before again, the haec nox est de qua scriptum est. But the interesting thing in 01 is that the Exultet is supplemented by smaller insertions that in a way reflect the prayer. And in this case, we have a greeting of the Easter night, Salve nox aeternarum deliciarum. And that is really one of the most notable characteristics of the personification usage in the Medingen Easter prayer books. The personified Easter night is greeted as well as simultaneously characterized in a specific way. And in this case, the greeting of the Easter night is focused on its role in relation to the Easter miracle. We remember the Easter night is the only one that knows the exact moment of the resurrection. That is one of the most prominent connotations of the personification of the Easter night in the Medingen prayer books. The second one also comes more or less directly from the Exultet, from that quote, and that is the understanding of the Easter night as bright and full of light as the day. We don't have an example for this in this passage. And to sum up my research for my dissertation, due to these specific characterizations of the personified Easter night, I interpreted the personification as a, in a way, reflective figure of the Easter miracle. And that goes beyond that specific passage here, because of course, this is not the only one featuring and addressing to the personified Easter night. There are actually far more, since 01 is a very complex manuscript, and the personification of the Easter night kind of reflects that in a way as well. And I think on that note, I'll hand over to Carolin, who knows far more than me about the complexity of 01.
Thank you so much, Marlene. That was actually brilliant. And I think it's always fun to learn additional information on this very particular manuscript. So as we all kind of know, this Easter prayer book had been produced by the nuns of the former Cistercian Abbey of Medingen. And so far, more than 50 manuscripts had been attributed to the convent. However, this manuscript stands out, as I recently found out that this manuscript is actually the product of an intense manuscript recycling. I use the term manuscript recycling to address the phenomenon that the nuns constantly rework their prayer books, and doing so, they adapted their prayer books to their changing piety profile. Andrew, maybe it would be possible to show 9 rectors. Sorry, I was mistaken there. Yeah, this is correct. As you can see, on folio 9 recto, the hand changes. So you have this very tiny script on the upper part of the manuscript, which actually shows some musical notation. And then you have a much brighter script, contemporary script on the lower parts of the page. And this had already been known before. So the catalogue entry stated that this manuscript had been produced by at least 2 hands. However, if you may turn to folio 68 verso, is that possible, Andrew? Could we turn to folio 68 verso? That would be brilliant. And seeing Andrew's fingers, you get an idea of how tiny the prayer book actually is. So if you have it in your hand, it's about this size, maybe not bigger than that. One more 68 verse. So thank you so much. Just a quick look at the page. You see that actually the hand changes again. So if you have a close look on the upper part of the folio, you see a very delicate script. But after the rubric, the script changes again. And if you have a really close look, you can see that the lower hand actually writes on a palimpsest. And you can see that the nuns really adopted their prayer books to their changing piety profile. They, so to say, replaced outdated material with updated versions. If you really have a look or browse through the entire manuscript, you can see that there are at least 5 different hands covering a period than more than 100 years of production. But some parts actually resisted or survived the recycling cycles. And one example is the Exultet on folio 20 verso. You can have a glimpse at the wonderful illuminations in the manuscript. That's an interesting page. Thank you, Andrew. We were at the right page. Thank you. So this is the beginning of the Exultet, and it reads, Exultet iam angelica turba celorum. So all the choirs of the angels rejoice. And this is actually what the nuns also depicted in the margins. You see the choir of the angel, and the angels play actually various instruments and join the rejoice of the resurrection of Christ. Another folio, I'm so sorry, Andrew, you have to turn the manuscript again, is 174 verso. So we go back at the end of the manuscript. You get an idea of the wonderful binding of the manuscript, which is also quite interesting from a research perspective. And you can see in the second part of the manuscript, there are not so many illuminations, but one really stands out. And this is actually the farewell to Easter Sunday at Vespers. You can see the valedictory prayer is accompanied by huge gold initials. And in the margins, you can see the nuns and the Lüneburg patricians. And interestingly, the illustration shows us a very particular feature of Medingen devotion, because it's bilingual. So the nuns actually in this depiction have a script roll which reads Vale odies sine vespera, whereas the lay people on the right have a vernacular script roll reading in Middle Low German, O Sötedag wolltest du bei uns bleiben. So they regret that Easter Sunday is actually over. I'm not so sure. I would have some more examples, but I'm not so sure about the time. So Henrike, just give me a hint. Should I come to?
I think, yeah, we'll do the Victime paschali laudes now, and then people can have special requests for more of the prayer book.
So just to let people know, I would have more material on the vernacular elements in the prayer books, or actually on paper cuts in the prayer book. So just give it a shout, maybe in the Q&A or the chat box, and we could return to that later. Just one more request, Andrew, if you could actually close the manuscript and show us the wonderful binding again, that would be fabulous. So this was actually also quite important for me, because the binding, so to say, was a hint for me when the recycling ended, and through a very long chain of evidence and relations to other manuscripts, you can pinpoint that down to the 1530s. And this binding is particularly interesting because it shows Prudentia, Lucretia and Venus, but not Suavitas. So if you have any additional information on the binding, please let us know in the chat box. Thank you so much, and over to Henrike.
Thank you. I think it became really nicely clear with Marlene and Carolin how this relationship of the nuns with the liturgy is one of taking and giving. So they take their cues for meditation from the liturgy, but they also feed back their impulses. And we can see that in the rubric they write for the Victime paschali laudes in the handbook, into the handbook of the Medingen provost. So the instruction on how to sing the sequence Victime paschali laudes in an exchange with the lay people comes out of this impulse of bilingual meditation, and also the conviction that everybody should join into the praise of Easter, and that it's what we are doing now, because we will also ask you to join into the Easter praise as the lay congregation would have done. So if you imagine the church in Medingen, at the east end the clergy would stand, at the west end it was a double decker, so on the ground floor the congregation, the parish would assemble, and on the raised gallery, which had the size of a chapel, the nuns would be singing. And on feast days everybody would join in together. If you stay for a moment at the Laudes Salvatori, Andrew, which you just had, because there we can actually see how the nuns wrote in the vernacular Christ ist erstanden as a response. So the first red initial reads Christ ist up, which is the Low German for auf, is upstande, as an answer to the Latin sequence. But the model for it came from the Victime paschali laudes, which gives the tune for the Christ ist erstanden. So the Victime paschali laudes, and then the vernacular tune is Christ ist erstanden. And I'll hand over now to Nick to train that with you. And probably if you take your PDF copies, then you are able to sing along, or you just pick it up by ear.
Thank you, Henrike, thank you. And I think possibly the idea of picking it up by ear is what lots of people will have done. But what we're going to do is just have a little practice of it now. We're going to practice two things. One is this repetitio, the chorus, if you like, the refrain, which is in German, and it goes like this. Christ ist erstanden vor der Mater alle, des sollen wir alle froh sein, Christ will unser Trost sein, Kyrie eleis. Now some of you may already recognize that as a tune in use in various places in Europe, including in England. So I'm not going to weigh this too much. Can we all try that together? Christ ist erstanden vor der Mater alle, des sollen wir alle froh sein, Christ will unser Trost sein, Kyrie eleis. Lovely, and I'm saying lovely because I'm sure that you were doing brilliantly back there, but of course, just to remind you, we can't hear you, so you can be making a complete mess of this, and nobody is going to discipline you or subject you to monastic discipline for having made a fault in choir, so don't worry about that. What we're now going to look at is something that you've got a little bit further down in the text, which is where the apostles, or the unbelieving, turn to Mary Magdalene and say, Dic nobis Maria, quid vidisti in via? Tell us, Mary, what did you see on the road? What sawest thou wayfaring, is the translation we've got there. Now it goes like this, it goes, Dic nobis Maria, quid vidisti in via. Try that again.
Dic nobis Maria, quid vidisti in via.
And then Mary Magdalene is going to respond and tell us. It's a very dramatic moment, which we are heightening here by asking Henrike to take the part of Mary Magdalene. But the liturgy itself is full of drama, full of movement at this point. I think this is not inappropriate that what we do is we hand this over to a solo singer to announce for the umpteenth time on this night and morning of Easter, Christ is risen. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear that Christ ist erstanden over and over as a repetitio, and you're also going to join in with that one line there, Dic nobis Maria, quid vidisti in via. So I hope you're all ready for this, and I'll try and get the pitch so that we don't have to go too low on the Dic nobis Maria. Victime paschali laudes, immolent Christiani.
Christ ist erstanden vor der Mater alle, des sollen wir alle froh sein. Christ will unser Trost sein, Kyrie eleis.
Agnus redemitovs, Christus innocens patri, reconciliavit peccatores.
Mors et vita duello, conflixere mirando, dux vitae mortuus regnat vivus.
Christ ist erstanden vor der Mater alle, des sollen wir alle froh sein. Christ will unser Trost sein, Kyrie eleis.
Dic nobis Maria, quid vidisti in via.
Sepulchrum Christi viventis, et gloriam vidiris urgentis, angelicus testis, sudarium et vestis, surrexit Christus spes mea, precedit nos in Galiläa.
Christ ist erstanden vor der Mater alle, des sollen wir alle froh sein. Christ will unser Trost sein, Kyrie eleis.
Wonderful. Happy Easter.
We have raced you through quite a bit of medieval liturgy, half of the church here, if not 3/4 of it. So I'm sure there will be questions. I haven't followed the Q&A section. Andrew, if you could moderate questions, or if people now just want to write it in the chat, what you would like to see more of.
So Carolin, you mentioned that you had a few more examples you mentioned of your cut and paste paper examples in the Medingen prayer book. Would you like to walk us through those?
Yeah, we could have a look at folio 115 verso 116 recto. I think there's also a question now in the chat box by Fred Briggs. Marlene, may you want to jump in while Andrew is turning on the manuscript?
You mean the question? Yeah. Yes, that is actually with the gold flashing. That was one of the first things I recognized when I looked at the manuscript in person, and what kind of started giving me an idea about my topic. So that is definitely something, and it's really quite telling. Most of the addressings to Easter night actually start with a very bright golden initial. It doesn't actually have to be a big one. It could also be just like a one line initial, but there is a lot of gold around this Easter night personification. So it is definitely this concept of a lightful night is really reflected in the
That's a good page actually, because it has also the Christ ist Upstande von der Martha alle below the S initial of the Salve Festa Dies. Yeah.
So yes, that is definitely reflected in the materiality as well, and the knowledge of the time of the resurrection. So what I thought it's as important and why I mentioned it, it is explicitly stated in Exultet, and that is like the first big personification of the night, because the night knows something, it can know something, it has the knowledge, and it's actually just the night has the knowledge. And that is why I focus on that in a way, because we don't know the exact time, just the night knows that, and that is what makes it so special, and that's what makes it so important, and why we celebrate it and why we actually address it and greet it.
Yeah, I think actually spending time with this manuscript is always fascinating, and you always discover new things about it. I remember Marlene had a first encounter with it and came back and was
blown away
by the manuscript.
I was.
It's really cool.
It's really cool. I spent 3 hours, like my whole time slot, and I looked at every single folio and I was not bored 1 minute. It was amazing.
Yeah, and I think the more time you spend with it, the more you see that it's not naive. It's very complex in its own rights. And this page Andrew is currently showing on display gives an insight on how this actually works. So on the left side, you see an illumination which shows Pope Gregory the Great, and the quotation actually reads, "Non enim fas est ut ea dietaceat lingua canis." So no voice or no tongue should be silenced in the praise of the Easter night or the resurrection. Andrew, that was actually bright. Now we can't see the illumination anymore. I'm so sorry. So every creature on earth actually should join the Easter praise, and that would actually mean that also the vernacular is needed in this case. And on the very right side, you see that the nuns directly put that into action in the illumination. So you see a little figure in the margins, and the scroll actually reads "Christ ist upstanden von der Martha," which the lay people would sing after the elevation of the cross and after the provost, and the confessor would sing the Latin Surrexus Dominus de Sepulchro and the Victime Paschalis laudes. So you see, these illuminations adds actually to the theological richness and show how the nuns used this theology or this input and created it and used it in their own prayer books. And this is what I always find so fascinating. You can see how the nuns shaped their own devotional profile while using different sources available in the networks of the nuns. Yeah, if there's any questions regarding that, I'm happy to answer more questions. But I've also seen that there is a question from Manina Jones, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Did the bindings of the books change after the completion of the original manuscript? Interesting question. So I'm really just about to find out more about the manuscript recycling in the Medingen convent. So back then, when I was still an undergraduate in Freiburg, I assumed that this manuscript would be maybe one of the very rare manuscripts within the corpus which actually show the feature of manuscript recycling. But right now I count more than 30 manuscripts out of the 50 which actually are a product of manuscript recycling. So you could say it's a maybe common practice within the convent, or also maybe in the Lüneburg convents. I'm still about to find out about that. But I would say that the binding was only put around the leaves after maybe in the end of the manuscript recycling. It's a kind of a termination point. And before that, we have some evidence that other prayer books, as for example, the Hanover prayer books, may not have been put into binding, or may not have been bound. So for me, investigating the binding tools always is a kind of indication when the process was completed. And so far, I assume that over a very large period of time, from the monastic reform onwards, way into the struggle to implement the Lutheran Reformation, the nuns constantly reworked their prayer books, add a different layer on layer on top, and so adopt their prayer books to their changing piety profile. It is interesting to see which leaves have been replaced and which has actually been kept. So the Exultet was kept, the depiction with the farewell prayer to Easter Sunday was kept, whereas other parts had been deliberately replaced. Everything after Easter Monday had been replaced by a later scribe. So we don't really know what was going on. I'm still about to explore more about it.
On the binding, we know that the convents sometimes sent batches of manuscript to Lüneburg to be bound in a professional workshop. And so probably this is one of the later batches to be sent. But we also know that the nuns then opened up the old bindings to insert further elements. So particularly noticeable in the Oxford Meding Psalter, where the scribe Margarete Hopes had to adapt to the Lutheran Reformation. So she had to cut out an invocation to John the Evangelist and replace it with an invocation of Christ as intercessor. So for that, she had to take out several leaves and hook in singletons in it. And you can see how she then repaired the paste down, which led to a whole series of events which are now too long to go into. But if Andrew, if you could put on again the handbook, there we can also see how the binding was adapted to fit the rearranged manuscript. So the binding was done probably by a professional workshop in Lüneburg for the first version of the handbook of the Meding provost, so 1470 about, when Thielemann von Bavenstedt, the provost, took over. And then it was opened up. The first, actually, 8 choirs were taken out, which would have been the collects for the whole liturgical year, because the space was needed to put in this additional Easter material. So it ended up with the same number of choirs. They could continue to use the sturdy wood and leather cover, but it has a completely different choir structure inside. And if you just open it, please, Andrew, you can see leftovers from the collectile that had been there at the beginning, which now has become the paste down. The blotches you see here on the opening page, you shouldn't be able to see because it should be pasted down, but you can see this recycling process in action. So the binding follows the original manuscript, but predates the additions that were added in 1478. I know it's now 5 to 7. Could I have a vote in the Q&A section what people would like to hear to finish off the session? So you can put in a 1 for the Lumen ad revelacionem, a 2 for parts of the Exultet, and a 3 for the Victime paschali laudes. Victime paschali laudes. Anybody seconding that? If there's no objection, we'll do the Victime paschali laudes. Yeah, so Tom summarized, it's mostly 3s that we are seeing.
Excellent. Good choice, everybody. Victime paschali laudes, immolent Christiani.
Christ ist erstanden, von der Mater alle, des sollen wir alle froh sein, Christ will unser Trost sein, Kyrie eleis.
Agnus redemitovers, Christus innocens patri, reconciliavit peccatores.
Mors et vita duello, confixera mirando, dux vitae mortuus regnat vivus. Christ ist erstanden, von der Mater alle, des sollen wir alle froh sein, Christ will unser Trost sein, Kyrie eleis. Dic nobis Maria, quid vidisti in via.
Sepulchrum Christi viventis, et gloriam vidis urgentis. Angelicus testis, sudarium et vestis, so vexit Christus spes mea, precedit sus in Galiläa.
Christ ist erstanden, von der Mater alle, des sollen wir alle froh sein, Christ will unser Trost sein, Kyrie eleis.
Thank you to everybody who came along. Thanks especially to Tom Revel, who was pulling the strings behind the scene as a Zoom master. And we'll upload this to the Oxford Medieval Studies YouTube channel, so you can revisit it anytime. And we hope to continue the series in the next year, taking you through the liturgical year. Goodbye.